Lee Priest competed nowadays in 212, do you think you would stand a chance against him?
No. He won't stand a chance against me, no.
Really? You didn't think you would have a chance at all?
I have a chance, he won't.
He wouldn't have a chance against you, that's
No.
what I mean.
No.
Why's that?
I'm just better.
Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding. I think you could probably guess that this one was coming. That clip that you just saw definitely made its waves in bodybuilding. You have the current 212 champion Keone Pearson saying he would easily defeat one of the greatest giant killer bodybuilders of all time, and one of the most notorious faces in our sport period. That of course being Lee Priest. Now when I saw this clip and all the reposts of it, I saw a lot of heated debate. I saw a lot of guys being very vocal and making their own videos on both sides of the aisle. And since Lee has a huge following, it definitely gets heated. But what I want to do today is chime in with some of my classic, fairly objective analysis. We're going to run through each mandatory pose and a few other metrics to determine if Keone could really beat the great Lee Priest easily, if at all. Now for each version I use today, this is going to be a little tricky. Keone is no problem at all though. I'm obviously going to use his 2024 Mr. Olympia version for this comparison. But for Lee, since he competed in the 90s and 2000s where good quality photos were hard to come by, for him I decided to take that limiting factor of just using one version off. Lee will have the advantage of using the best photo regardless of the year, regardless of the contest. Keone has the advantage of modern photos and whatnot, so I think it's more than fair to use any picture of Lee for any given pose. And he's a legend who has already earned his stripes and a place in the Bodybuilding Hall of Fame, and if Keone wants to make a claim like he did in that clip, then he should be able to beat any and all versions of Lee Priest. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into today's comparison. Here's 2024 212 Mr. Olympia Keone Pearson versus Lee Priest. Remember, if you guys like these types of videos, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. I'm going to add just one more disclaimer here before we really get into this one. The sizing in this comparison is iffy at best. Chalk it up to the photos I had to use of Lee. The angles were really varied and harsh. Luckily, he's about the same height as Keone, so the margin of error window is pretty small. Oh, and by the way, most of the photos you are going to see for Lee will be from the year 1997, whether that be from the Olympia or other shows, as I feel that that was his best year. Anyway, sizing and other discrepancies aside, Keone has a clear structural advantage. And this would be true even if I sized Lee many inches taller. Keone just has one of the best structures of all time. Combine that with insane width, those insane proportions, and muscle bellies, and that's a recipe for a dominant win against 90% of bodybuilders ever in the front double. I'm not even joking. Against Lee, Keone easily takes the quads. This is something we'll get into a little later and a lot throughout this video, but Lee's condition, even at his best, was never top notch, and that affects him in certain areas. Not only is Keone bigger in the quads, but he's way more detailed. Lee does win the calves though, as far as the lower half is concerned. But moving up, the torso doesn't get any better for Lee. There's definitely just something so pleasing about that long torso Y-frame look that Lee pulls off, but Keone is just on another level. They have pretty much the same size waist, but Keone is doubly wider than Lee through the lats and shoulders. But of course it is called the front double pose, so what about the arms? Well yes, I am of course giving Lee the arms, but even here it's kinda close. Don't get me wrong, Lee is on the list to have the best arms of all time, but I would also put Keone on that list too. I would put him lower on said list however. What I like about Lee's arms more than Keone's are really just the forearms mainly. I think it really completes a great set of guns. Outside of that though, I can't honestly look at this photo and tell you Lee smokes Keone in the arms, because he doesn't. And what does that leave us with? A pretty solid win for Keone. Again, Lee's shape is so appealing, but Keone is not even human looking. And he wins every single body part easily except the arms, and that's razor thin. Now in my comparisons, I use a margin of victory point system. On my scorecard, I mark poses down as 1, 2, or 3 point wins, for coin toss wins, solid wins, and dominant wins respectively. As much as I love you, Lee, you can't deny Keone is taking this pose easily. Lee hangs in there because he wins the arms and has that appealing shape, but outside of that, this just has to be a 2-pointer for the 212 champ. Next, we have the front lat spread. Lee's photo here is actually from the 1997 Ironman Pro, which Ronnie Coleman always points out as being one of his toughest losses. I really like the pic and it's a flattering angle for Lee, so I just threw it in here. Regardless of the angle though, I think he's legitimately good in the lats from the front. But based on the last pose, I think it is pretty safe to say that Keone would win on a real stage side by side, simply because he's wider, not just through the actual lats, but in the rib cage and the shoulders too. Other than that, the rest of the upper body is pretty similar for these guys. They're both pretty even in the chest, delts, and arms. But then when you turn your attention to the lower body, Keone easily wins once again. And with that, I do think Keone clinches this pose too. They're both pretty close up top surprisingly. Even if you prefer Lee, once you include the lower body, that brings Keone's average up to just slightly surpass Lee here. I'll give Lee a big benefit of the doubt though. He looks a lot better than I remember in the upper body on this one, and getting close to Keone is not an easy feat. And Keone's ab split is a little more visible in this shot, and I hate it. So let's go ahead and just make this a 1-point win for Keone. I'm sure I'll be getting pushback on the 2-pointer margin in the first shot, so this should even things out just a little bit here. Let's go ahead and turn these guys to the side for the side chest. Lee has 2 picks here. One was for scaling, and the other one I included just because it was from the 1997 Mr. Olympia, which was his best Mr. Olympia showing. But 2002 was a great version as well, which is where the middle photo is from. Try as he might though, even with his best versions, Keone takes this pose too. The side leg is Keone's biggest win. Lee just isn't and really wasn't ever in the best condition. Keone is also a bit bigger than Lee in both photos, and then he has that big step up in quality. The upper half is a bit better for Lee though. First off, he does win the arm, but Keone is still great and he turns around and wins the delt. Then in the chest, their pec shapes are honestly pretty similar. Keone is just a bigger version of the same muscle belly. Keone is also very wide at the shoulders, which helps him bolster what he was doing in the individual body parts. From the overall perspective, he's bigger and more impressive. Keone is winning pretty much everything, but Lee is pretty solid here. Although this is just a little too inclusive to give Keone just a 1-point win, so 2 will have to do. Now we have the first back pose, and for those comments I saw defending Keone's claims, this was usually that crowd's main argument. Lee never had the best back, probably his weakest body part, and his conditioning was lackluster, which is not a very conducive recipe for success. And at least here in the rear double, those people defending Keone are pretty correct. This is going to be a hurdle for Lee. First off, in the lower body, this was actually one of the more conditioned versions of Lee, the 1997 Hungarian Pro, but Keone is still clearly in a tier above conditioning wise. He's much drier and more detailed overall, not to mention he's bigger. He has more developed hams, glutes, adductors, quad sweeps, everything but calves. But of course, Lee famously once said, "Who cares about striated glutes?" Well, okay then, what about the back? Keone isn't even that good either in the back. This is also his weakest body part, I'd say. But again, he's just a tier above Lee. They both have higher lats, leaving both of their lower backs shallow, but through the lats themselves and the upper back, Keone just has more back. There's just more meat there. Lee looks a little flat. The nooks and crannies of his back between these muscles are not as deep as Keone's. Furthermore, add the delts and arms in there for Keone too. I think from this angle he can beat Lee in the arms, and his delts are much bigger. So overall, whether you care about striated glutes or not, Keone is winning the lower half, and then he turns around and wins the upper half too. So you have upper and lower, 1 + 1 is 2, so Keone is taking another 2 points here. It's really hard to score the front lat spread any differently. I will say it is closer than the rear double, but there are some things that are a little too obvious. For one, it's conditioning. Once again, that wins Keone the lower body, but Lee does look really big here. They're very similar, honestly, muscle bellies wise, but Keone is just a little bit bigger, more complete, and shredded. And then up top, the other main hurdle for Lee to get over is the width. Keone is wider. However, as a whole, I think I do prefer Lee's back. Keone looks pretty thin. Lee was the one looking flimsy in the last pose, but now it's flipped. He carries a lot more thickness in the lats, traps, and even a good lower back. And because Keone doesn't have a good level of thick development, his conditioning edge really isn't as evident here as it is downstairs or even in the back in the last shot. So even though Lee is more narrow than Keone, I prefer Lee's back all around. However, this pose is all about width, and Lee doesn't have that over Keone. And once again, when you add the lower body into the equation, I think that brings Keone's average up just enough to get past Lee. Now, I originally had this as a 2-pointer for Keone, but now that I'm looking at it and realizing I prefer Lee's back, I'm just going to make it a 1-point win for Keone. He wins the more obvious and important things, so I think he is the more objective winner, but I do see an argument for Lee. Here in our next side pose, we have quite the battle. This would be extremely close if not for someone completely tripping themselves up here. Anyway, Keone remains the king in the lower body for condition. Lee is actually looking very big here though compared to some of the other versions I've used throughout this comparison. But that could be the low angle of his photo. Up top, these guys are fairly even in the chest and delt. However, Lee is taking the crown jewel of this pose. He is much thicker in his tricep compared to Keone. Keone has some striations in his, but Lee is more than separated enough to let his overwhelming mass do do all the talking. Now, you may have noticed I left out a crucial area of the pose, the midsection. Up until this point, it's a close pose. Lee wins the tricep, but they're pretty much even everywhere else, with Keone taking the lower half. But the midsection is where Lee secures a solid win. I'm not going to talk too much about it here in this shot because the abs and thighs pose is next, but Keone has a pretty atrocious ab split, and a little bit of a pot belly when he's not doing the vacuum. Lee contrasts this with quite literally one of the best midsections of all time. I'll cut Keone a little slack for bringing a solid pose outside of the midsection issue. He did win the lower half and he's solid up top, but even that I feel is a little generous. I think with a flaw like that, Lee kinda wins automatically, especially because he's keeping it close on the side leg and also wins the tricep. I'll do 2 points for Lee, but in no way, shape, or form am I downplaying Keone's issue. As promised, we have to talk about Keone's ab split now because we're discussing the abs and thighs pose. It is a flaw just confined to one area, but it's one of 2 main areas being called for in the pose. And it's so detrimental that it's pretty much disqualifying for him here. Again, when he doesn't do the vacuum, it's pretty rough. He tries to remedy that with a twisting oblique shot, but I think it's just as bad. Keone's loss here is made all the more clear when he is standing next to someone like Lee. Lee has one of the best abs and thighs poses ever. I know he's not gonna like me saying this, but he's just kinda like Sean Ray. They both have long torsos, small waist, 8-packs, but Lee has the slightly bigger, slightly less sharp legs compared to Sean Ray. But obviously, if I'm comparing Lee to Sean Ray, he's doing something more than right. Now, I do have to point out that Lee is not winning the quads against any of Keone's poses ever. That's been the most consistent thing throughout this comparison, but his abs are doing all the work. Keone's twisting pose is completely DOA against Lee for that bloated stomach, but Keone does provide us with a vacuum pose, and I am going to remain consistent with my own rules. I count vacuums in my comparisons if and only if the crunched abs pose is hit beforehand. And yeah, Keone does technically do that. And you know, if I counted vacuums as equal to crunched abs poses, this shot would actually be a coin toss, because it comes down to a phenomenal vacuum pose and a phenomenal crunched abs variation. But I don't think they're even because it is called the abs and thighs pose. To me, abs are always going to take precedent over vacuum. However, I am going to give Keone a little credit for that amazing vacuum. Legitimately, that is a 10 out of 10 pose, just as much as Lee's is, to be honest. And we should probably reward Keone for his quads, which he wins easily. They are technically half of the pose. But again, that actual crunched abs version was just so poor for Keone, so I am hesitant to do this, but let's just go ahead and give Lee 2 points here. And finally, we have the most muscular. The sizing on this one is probably a bit off because the photo of Lee was cut off at his knees, but it's whatever really, it doesn't matter. Keone wins easily, or at least he would have if not for that horrible ab split. That's 3 poses in a row now that has ruined. But seriously, even in this shot, other than that flaw, Keone wins. Legs, consider it done. I'm glad I can stop mentioning them now. In the upper half, Keone is wider and carries more overall mass, making him look more impressive, and in the most muscular pose, he is the more muscular guy. Lee wins the arms for those bicep peaks, but Keone has a lot of size here to hang, and the delts are massive on Keone as well. The chests, although, are a little disappointing for both guys. So I would actually give this pose to Keone if only the midsection was just passable, but it's a glaring issue. My eyes go there every single time, and I doubt I'm alone on that. Lee has a lot to be proud of too, outside of just winning the midsection easily in this shot. He does win the arms as stated, and he's more detailed than Keone in the chest and delts, which probably puts those things into his column. He is the less muscular guy though, and loses the legs by a lot, which is tough. Regardless of those things though, I'm still giving him the pose. It's just a 1 point because I don't think Lee should technically be winning, but he does because of Keone's stomach. We're now moving on to the second round of judging. This round of judging is for the overall physique categories, where we look at the whole physique based on 4 different metrics: muscularity, conditioning, flaws, and shape. We're going to go ahead and start with shape. This is conclusive. Keone is winning here, but he won't be winning by 3 points, but it's still pretty solid. I'm just cutting Lee some slack because legitimately there was nothing wrong with his shape. It's very appealing. Keone is just too cartoonish, however. That X-frame and his overall proportions would beat just about anyone legitimately. For example, I would have Keone taking this category over someone like Andrew Jacked or even Flex Wheeler. Keone's structure is that good, so while Lee and Keone are both winners, Keone is no doubt the stronger of the two. In muscularity, Keone is going to get another strong win as well. That bigger, wider frame that Keone has pays dividends here as well, because a bigger frame means more muscle. Keone was overall bigger than Lee. I think I mentioned that in just about every pose. The only areas Lee was actually bigger in were the calves and arms. And muscularity just isn't about being bigger, this category is also about being complete too. Keone and Lee definitely have weaker body parts, but Keone back to front, top to bottom had the better development on average, especially in the legs and back. So this is going to be another strong win for Keone, 2 points, maybe even 3, but I want to be conservative since my sizing on this one wasn't the greatest and it can affect this category. That brings us to conditioning now, and I'm sounding like a broken record, but again, it's a strong win for Keone. Originally, I put this category down for a 3-pointer against Keone, but I decided to only consider Lee's best version for this category. I did that with the mandatory poses. So when I imagined this category, I only put Lee's best, most shredded version against Keone in my scenario. Sure, Lee had some pretty off versions, and I was just going to take the average of all of them, and if I did, I think it would have been 3 points. But when you account for his best, I think it gets a bit better. Not much better, it's still a 2-point win for Keone, but definitely better than if we considered a version like 2003 and included other versions like that into the average. We have one more category left now, and that's the flaws section, and I think you all know what I'm going to say. Lee doesn't have any flaws outside of what we already counted, like a lack of condition. I do not double up on docking a guy for something like that. This is not what this particular category is about. Something we have to include though is Keone looking like he just walked off the set of Ridley Scott's Alien. I've talked about it enough, we all know about it, he knows about it. It doesn't seem to bother him too much, but I am going to be slapping a big 3-point loss on him though. It's a major flaw, and no, nothing's going to change my mind. And that brings us to the end of the comparison. A comparison I'm sure many people will be torn on. But before I reveal the final scores, let me try and get ahead of what I'm about to say. First off, let's take the nostalgia goggles off. We're here to compare physiques, not feelings or legacy. I'm not asking who the greatest bodybuilder of the two is. That's different from what I'm trying to do, which is figure out who is the best. With that said, it was a little closer than I thought, but Keone Pearson was still able to defeat the great Lee Priest, scoring 63.3 points to Lee's 36.7. To sum it up, Keone has things that are extremely good on his physique. He also has things that aren't as good but are still very solid, and pretty much only one major flaw, albeit a pretty bad one. That structure on Keone is probably top 5 of all time, and there was little Lee could do about it. Keone had a more pleasing, bigger structure, and he was bigger muscle-wise too. He also had less gaps compared to Lee. The legs from all angles were no match for Lee's, and Keone had a stronger overall back between the two poses. And then conditioning too, Lee's was just never that good. Keone did have the horrendous ab split, but again, it's one flaw, one that's quickly remedied when he vacuums in most poses. And I punished Keone heavily for that flaw anyway, and it still wasn't enough to prevent him from losing. He did enough elsewhere to outwork it and then some. So that pretty much means Keone wins all the major things to be looked at, from muscle, condition, mandatories. He won it all pretty much with varying margins. So to respond to his claim at the beginning of the video, I do agree that he beats Lee Priest. Now Lee 100% has had the more impactful legacy at this point in time, and honestly, I don't know if it can ever be topped by Keone, but Lee's physique is. Keone is legitimately a once-in-a-generation athlete. He'd beat a lot of your favorites, not just Lee Priest. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. If this video goes over as well as Keone's comments did, then I'm sure this comment section will be at least a little heated. Who do you think won this comparison and why? That's the important part. Why do you think that particular person won? Go ahead and leave me your thoughts down in the comments. And if you guys liked this video, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And if you want to support the channel even further and get yourself some high quality supplements, be sure to head over to Arms Race Nutrition. Then at checkout, use my code PROJECT10 for 10% off your entire order. That's code PROJECT10 at armsracenutrition.com. And finally, with all that said, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.
Gotta get that Lexi, yeah.